The mountain had a way of swallowing sound. Even the wind seemed to move carefully there, as if afraid of waking something old. When the fire burned through the sisters' cabin, it didn't roar like flames were supposed to. It crept. By the time the smoke reached the valley, most of the town already knew which house was burning, and more importantly, what might be found beneath it. They called them the Appalachian Sisters, though few could remember when they'd first earned that name. To some, they were ghosts who walked upright. To others, they were a warning. Pale figures seen at dawn near the tree line, heads bowed, dresses too thin for the cold. Children were told not to stare if they passed by, not because the sisters were dangerous, but because looking too closely invited questions no one wanted answered. When the sheriff arrived, the fire had already exposed the cellar door. It hung open like a mouth that had finally decided to speak. The smell drifting up wasn't just smoke and damp earth, it carried years of secrecy, rot layered over silence. Men from the town gathered faster than the fire trucks, standing shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing, their eyes fixed on the dark below. No one asked where the sisters had gone. That, more than anything, unsettled the outsiders who came later. Records showed the sisters were born there, yet somehow never existed beyond the mountain's edge. No school photos. No hospital files. Just a few fading mentions in church ledgers, names written once and never again. As the embers cooled, whispers began to rise, cautious at first, then hungry. Stories about bargains made long ago, about a town that chose endurance over innocence. The mountain, after all, had always demanded payment. And now, with the cellar open and the sisters missing, it seemed ready to collect what was still owed. The first turning point begins with a fire that was never meant to be noticed beyond the ridge. Late at night, when the town was sealed behind locked doors and unspoken routines, flames broke through the roof of a weather-beaten cabin perched high above the Appalachian Valley. The house belonged to two sisters everyone knew about but no one truly knew, women who lived apart from town life and were spoken of in lowered voices, as if naming them too loudly might draw something unwelcome closer. The fire itself seemed unnatural, burning slowly, unevenly, as though it were revealing the structure piece by piece rather than destroying it outright. When neighbors finally climbed the narrow trail, they expected to find a simple tragedy, two recluses overcome by smoke, another sad footnote in a hard mountain life. Instead, the fire peeled away the cabin's foundation and exposed a concealed cellar that should not have existed. Beneath warped floorboards lay a reinforced door, its hinges rusted from the inside, its lock worn smooth by years of use. The sight alone shifted the air around the scene. What had once been dismissed as isolation now felt deliberate, engineered. Inside the cellar were signs of long-term habitation that contradicted everything the town believed about the sisters. There were bedding areas, not just one but several, along with chains bolted into stone and markings scratched deep into the walls. Some markings looked like tallies, others like names partially erased. The space suggested confinement, not storage, and survival under conditions that required secrecy. It became immediately clear that this was not a place built quickly or recently. It had been planned, maintained, and hidden with care. The absence of the sisters deepened the shock. No bodies were found in the ruins, no remains in the cellar, no clear evidence of escape. Their disappearance raised a more disturbing possibility that they had not been victims of the fire, but participants in whatever the cellar represented. That uncertainty fractured the town's shared understanding of who the sisters were. Were they prisoners, caretakers, witnesses, or something else entirely? Each possibility carried implications that reached far beyond the burned cabin. As authorities began to secure the site, townspeople gathered at a distance, their reactions carefully measured. Some looked afraid, others relieved, a few unmistakably angry. The discovery of the cellar did more than reveal a hidden space, it cracked open a history the town had collectively agreed not to examine. The fire had stripped away the mountain's camouflage, leaving behind a question no one could bury again: what kind of life had been hidden beneath that house, and who had known it was there all along? The second turning point unfolded not in the ashes of the cabin, but in the measured, almost rehearsed response of the town itself. By morning, the story had already been narrowed, shaped into something manageable. Before investigators from outside the county could arrive, the town elders convened an informal meeting at the municipal hall, doors closed, voices low. They referred to the fire as an unfortunate accident, a private family matter that had no bearing on the wider community. The language they used was careful, stripped of curiosity, designed to end conversation rather than invite it. Word spread quickly that speaking to outsiders was unnecessary and potentially harmful. Longtime residents were reminded of the town's reputation, its fragile economy, its dependence on being forgotten by the rest of the state. The elders insisted that nothing found on the mountain was unusual for isolated homesteads, dismissing the cellar as an old storm shelter, the markings as the idle scratches of neglect. Anyone who questioned these explanations was met with polite smiles and subtle warnings about stirring trouble where none was needed. Local law enforcement echoed the same tone. The sheriff's initial report avoided detail, describing the site in broad, vague terms that left little room for follow-up. He emphasized the lack of confirmed victims and framed the sisters' absence as likely relocation or confusion caused by the fire. There was no request for forensic support, no missing person alert, no urgency. To the outside eye, it appeared the case was already being put to rest before it had truly begun. What unsettled some residents was not what was being said, but how quickly everyone seemed to agree. People who had not spoken to one another in years suddenly shared the same talking points. Shop owners repeated identical phrases. Church leaders redirected concern toward prayer rather than inquiry. Even casual conversations on porches and in diners fell silent when the subject arose, replaced by a practiced shrug and a change of topic. It felt less like consensus and more like obedience. Beneath the calm surface, fear moved quietly. Older townspeople remembered other incidents that had been smoothed over in similar fashion, events that were never written down but were carried in memory like inherited debt. The elders' insistence on control suggested that the discovery of the cellar threatened more than 2 missing women. It hinted at a pattern, a long-standing agreement to protect something rooted deep in the mountain's past. As reporters and state officials began to take interest, barriers went up. Access roads were blocked for safety reasons. Records were delayed. Calls went unanswered. The town presented itself as cooperative while offering nothing of substance. This coordinated silence marked a critical shift, transforming the discovery from an isolated mystery into a confrontation between truth and survival, and revealing that whatever had been hidden on the mountain was something the town had chosen, collectively, to guard. The third turning point emerged quietly, through the memory of someone the town had long learned to overlook. A retired schoolteacher, sorting through old lesson plans and attendance books in her attic, began to feel unsettled by the names circulating after the fire. She had taught nearly every child in the valley for over 30 years, could recall faces, handwriting, even the way certain students walked into a room. Yet the sisters' names stirred nothing. That absence gnawed at her more than any rumor spreading through town. Driven by unease, she retrieved decades-old school registers stacked in brittle boxes. Page by page, year by year, she searched for the sisters' names, expecting to find at least a trace, a brief enrollment followed by withdrawal. Instead, there was nothing. No records of attendance, no transfer notes, no disciplinary marks. In a town where even children who stayed only a few weeks were documented, this kind of omission felt impossible. It was as if the sisters had lived parallel lives, visible in flesh but invisible on paper. Her concern deepened when she cross-referenced church youth rosters, vaccination lists, and county census copies she had kept out of habit. The pattern repeated itself. Birth records existed, sparse but real, yet everything after infancy dissolved into blank space. The sisters had grown up without leaving the administrative footprints that defined everyone else's existence. This was not neglect or poor bookkeeping. It was removal. When the teacher quietly raised her findings with a former colleague, the reaction was immediate and sharp. She was advised, not unkindly, to stop digging. The past was fragile, she was told, and reopening it would only bring harm. The warning carried an undercurrent of fear that startled her more than anger would have. It suggested that others already knew what she was discovering and had accepted it as necessary. As word spread discreetly among a few trusted individuals, more inconsistencies surfaced. A librarian noted missing volumes from local archives, years where town council minutes were incomplete or rewritten. A nurse remembered being instructed long ago to redirect certain medical questions away from county reporting channels. These fragments formed a disturbing picture of coordinated erasure, not just of the sisters, but of entire stretches of time connected to them. The realization reframed the fire entirely. The sisters had not simply lived in isolation, they had been systematically excluded from the official life of the town. Their existence was tolerated only so long as it remained undocumented, unexamined, and unspoken. This turning point shifted suspicion away from the mountain itself and toward the people living in its shadow, revealing that the darkest secret was not what had been hidden underground, but how thoroughly a community had learned to make two human lives disappear without leaving a trace. The fourth turning point took shape beyond the burned cabin, woven into the forest that surrounded it. As investigators expanded their search radius, they began noticing marks carved into the trees along the old footpaths leading up the mountain. At first, the cuts seemed random, dismissed as hunters' signs or idle knife work. But the repetition was impossible to ignore. The same symbols appeared again and again, spaced deliberately, some freshly cut, others so old they had grown distorted as the bark healed around them. Locals avoided explaining the markings directly. When asked, they gave half answers about boundary signs or forgotten property lines, explanations that unraveled under even mild scrutiny. A forestry officer eventually photographed the carvings and compared them with archived images of folk symbols once used in the region generations earlier. The resemblance was unmistakable. These were not casual marks but ritual symbols tied to old mountain practices meant to protect, bind, or ward off what was believed to be dangerous knowledge rather than physical threats. What made the discovery unsettling was how the symbols formed a loose perimeter around the sisters' land. They were not placed to guide people toward the cabin, but to define a boundary, marking where something began that was not meant to spread. The mountain itself seemed partitioned, divided into a space that followed ordinary rules and another governed by customs the town no longer openly acknowledged. Older residents recognized the symbols instantly, though few admitted it aloud. In hushed conversations, they recalled stories told by their grandparents about times when the town relied on folk rites during periods of famine, violence, or lawlessness. These practices were said to ensure survival, but always at a cost. The carvings were part of an agreement, a way of reminding everyone where that cost was being paid. The sisters' presence within that boundary took on new meaning. Their isolation no longer seemed like neglect or coincidence but an extension of those rituals. The symbols suggested that the sisters were bound to the land in a role passed down, not chosen. Whether they were meant to guard a secret, absorb blame, or serve as living reminders of an old bargain remained unclear, but the implication was chilling. The mountain had not simply hidden them, it had claimed them. As news of the carvings spread, town leaders doubled down on denial, insisting the symbols were meaningless relics with no connection to modern life. Yet the effort to dismiss them only reinforced their significance. The forest had preserved what records could not, cutting through decades of silence with scars that refused to fade. The symbols linked the sisters' story to something older and far more deliberate than a single family's tragedy, revealing that the secret buried in the mountain was sustained not just by fear, but by tradition carefully maintained and never truly abandoned. The fifth turning point surfaced through a file that was never meant to be reopened. While reviewing old county logs connected loosely to the land around the mountain, an outside investigator noticed a reference number that didn't match any active case. Tracing it led to a missing persons report filed more than 30 years earlier, involving a teenage girl who vanished while walking home from a seasonal job near the same ridge. At the time, the case had been quietly deprioritized, attributed to a runaway narrative that satisfied paperwork without demanding answers. As the details were examined more closely, similarities to the sisters' situation began to emerge. The missing girl was last seen near the same footpaths marked by the carved symbols. Witness statements were brief, oddly restrained, and several were signed by individuals who still lived in the town. The language used in the report mirrored the phrasing now being used to describe the sisters' disappearance, suggesting a template rather than coincidence. Photographs attached to the old file intensified the unease. The girl's clothing, posture, and even facial structure bore a striking resemblance to one of the sisters. While not identical, the similarity was enough to raise questions about lineage, repetition, and whether this was the first time someone had vanished into the mountain's shadow. Marginal notes in the file hinted at pressure from local officials to close the case quickly, citing community stability as justification. When investigators attempted to interview surviving witnesses, resistance resurfaced. Some claimed fading memory. Others abruptly refused to speak. One former deputy admitted off record that he had been instructed to limit the search area decades ago, told there was no point looking beyond a certain tree line. The same boundary now outlined by the folk symbols. The implication was devastating. The town had not only failed to protect the missing girl, it had actively participated in containing the truth. As the case was reclassified and reopened, more connections appeared. Another name surfaced, then another, each tied loosely to the mountain and each ending in administrative silence. None had been officially linked before. The sisters' story was no longer isolated but part of a pattern that stretched across generations, suggesting a cycle rather than an anomaly. This turning point shattered the illusion that the town's secret was confined to one hidden cellar or two missing women. It revealed a legacy of disappearances treated as necessary losses, absorbed into the mountain's history and rationalized as the cost of endurance. The resurfacing of the old case forced a reckoning with the possibility that the sisters were not the origin of the secret, but its latest inheritors, living proof of a system that had been quietly feeding the mountain with human lives for decades. The sixth turning point arrived when the investigation shifted from individuals to relationships, exposing how deeply the town itself was woven into the secret. What had first appeared as isolated acts of silence began to reveal a network of shared responsibility that crossed family lines, church affiliations, and business ties. No single household could be blamed without implicating others, and that collective entanglement explained the town's instinctive resistance to scrutiny. Property records showed that the land surrounding the sisters' cabin had passed quietly between a small group of families over generations, often for symbolic prices or through informal agreements that avoided public notice. These families also appeared repeatedly in council minutes, school boards, and volunteer committees, always positioned close enough to influence decisions without drawing attention. Their influence wasn't loud or authoritarian, it was subtle, reinforced by kinship, debt, and obligation. Interviews with younger residents revealed something even more unsettling. Many spoke of growing up with unspoken rules about certain areas of the mountain, places they were told never to enter and never to ask about. These warnings didn't come from one authority figure but from everyone, parents, teachers, neighbors, all repeating the same boundaries. The consistency suggested a shared understanding passed down like folklore, normalized through repetition until it no longer felt like secrecy at all. As pressure increased, fractures began to show. One family member admitted that their grandparents had believed protecting the secret was a form of stewardship, a duty inherited rather than chosen. Another confessed that refusing to participate would have meant financial ruin, social exile, or worse. The town's economy, fragile and isolated, had relied on mutual dependence for survival. Breaking silence would not only expose the truth but dismantle the structure that kept people fed, housed, and protected. This realization reframed the moral landscape. The town was not simply covering up a crime, it was sustaining a system built on shared compromise. Responsibility was diluted across generations, making it easier for each person to claim they had done nothing personally wrong. Yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. Silence had been organized, taught, and enforced, even when no one could remember who first demanded it. As these revelations surfaced, fear turned inward. People began to realize that exposing the secret meant implicating their own families, their own livelihoods, their own past decisions. The mountain was no longer just a physical presence but a symbol of the burden everyone carried. This turning point stripped away the comfort of blaming faceless ancestors or distant authorities, revealing that the town's darkest secret endured not because of one powerful figure, but because an entire community had agreed, piece by piece, to protect it together. The seventh turning point emerged from the ruins in a way that felt almost intentional, as though the mountain itself had decided to release one carefully chosen fragment of truth. During a secondary search of the fire site, an evidence technician found a metal lockbox wedged behind a collapsed support beam in the cellar. Unlike the rest of the space, it showed signs of being handled recently, its surface cleaned, its lock oiled. Inside was a journal wrapped in oilcloth, the pages warped by heat but still legible. The handwriting shifted throughout the book, sometimes neat and controlled, sometimes jagged and hurried, as if written under threat. Dates stretched back years, overlapping with periods when the sisters were believed to be inactive, invisible. The earliest entries were observational rather than confessional. They described arrivals and departures, names spoken in whispers, footsteps above the cellar at night. The sisters wrote not as architects of the events around them, but as chroniclers trapped within them. What the journal revealed was a pattern of forced witnessing. The sisters recorded transactions they did not understand at first, meetings held without their consent, decisions made around them as though they were fixtures rather than people. They described being told when to stay silent, when to appear, when to disappear. Their role, as outlined repeatedly in the pages, was to remember what others wanted forgotten, to carry the knowledge so no one else had to. Several entries detailed moments when the sisters attempted to resist, asking questions that were met with punishment or isolation. They wrote about being reminded of their purpose, of the consequences if they failed to comply. The language suggested coercion embedded so deeply it masqueraded as duty. Over time, the tone shifted from fear to grim clarity. The sisters came to understand that their survival depended on observation without interference. Names appeared throughout the journal, often abbreviated, sometimes crossed out, sometimes followed by dates and locations. Cross-referencing these with town records aligned disturbingly well with the resurfaced missing persons cases. The sisters had been present for events the town officially denied had ever happened. They were not participants, but proof. Perhaps most chilling were the final entries, written shortly before the fire. The sisters expressed certainty that something was changing, that the system protecting the secret was weakening. They wrote about being watched more closely, about discussions they were no longer meant to hear. The fire, according to the journal, was not an accident but an attempt to erase the last living record. This turning point collapsed the narrative the town had relied on. The sisters were no longer shadows to be feared or blamed. They were unwilling witnesses, burdened with truth so others could live unburdened by it, their silence not chosen, but enforced, their disappearance not mysterious, but necessary to those who had built their lives on forgetting. The eighth turning point began when an investigator from outside the region stopped treating the town as a collection of individuals and started viewing it as a closed system. Rather than focusing on the cellar or the missing sisters, they mapped patterns of influence, debt, and obligation that shaped daily life. What emerged was a quiet architecture of control, one that didn't rely on overt violence but on consequences everyone understood without needing them spelled out. Financial records revealed that many families owed their livelihoods to a handful of shared enterprises tied to the land, timber leases, informal mining rights, seasonal contracts that never appeared in official filings. These arrangements kept money circulating locally but also ensured dependence. Speaking out meant risking employment, credit at the only supply store, or access to land that had been worked by the same families for generations. Silence was not demanded, it was incentivized. Church records and community aid logs showed another layer. Assistance during hard winters, medical emergencies, and legal trouble often came from the same network of elders who now insisted on restraint. Help was remembered. So was defiance. Those who questioned the past too loudly found themselves slowly cut off, not dramatically, but enough to make life unbearable in a place with few alternatives. The investigator also uncovered a pattern of selective enforcement. Minor offenses committed by certain families vanished from records, while others were pursued aggressively. This imbalance created an unspoken hierarchy of safety and vulnerability. People learned early which names were protected and which were expendable. Fear didn't need to be renewed, it was inherited. Interviews with former residents who had left years earlier filled in what locals would not say. They described an atmosphere where asking the wrong question could follow you for life, where children were taught caution before curiosity. Several recalled moments when adults abruptly changed topics or ended conversations whenever the mountain was mentioned, reactions too consistent to be coincidence. As these findings came together, the investigator realized the truth had been enforced not through a single threat, but through an ecosystem of pressure. Every person played a role, whether by offering silence, obedience, or quiet reinforcement. No one needed to issue orders because the cost of disobedience was already known. This turning point reframed the town's resistance as something more complex than guilt. It was survival behavior shaped over decades, a structure designed to protect itself by absorbing dissent and isolating those who refused to conform. The secret endured not because everyone agreed with it, but because the system made disagreement too dangerous to sustain. The ninth turning point shattered the last illusion that the secret existed only to preserve tradition or silence shame. As financial audits and land use histories were finally forced into the open, a stark truth emerged. The town's survival was materially tied to what had been hidden in the mountain hollows. Beneath the folklore and ritual boundaries lay resources that had quietly sustained the community for decades, resources exploited outside legal oversight and protected by collective silence. Old geological surveys, long dismissed as outdated, revealed mineral deposits that had never been officially extracted. Yet equipment logs, supply orders, and injury reports told another story. Small-scale operations had been running intermittently, disguised as seasonal labor or private land maintenance. The mountain was not just sacred or feared, it was profitable. And that profitability depended on remaining invisible. The cellar beneath the sisters' cabin sat directly above one of the access points. The perimeter marked by folk symbols wasn't just symbolic protection, it was practical deterrence. Outsiders stayed away. Locals knew better than to wander. The sisters' isolation served a function, discouraging curiosity while anchoring the boundary in something human, something unsettling enough to keep distance without explanation. As documents were cross-referenced, it became clear that during economic downturns, activity around the mountain increased. Families that later defended silence most aggressively were the same ones who weathered those periods with unusual stability. The missing persons cases aligned disturbingly well with expansions of these operations, moments when secrecy was most critical and risk highest. This revelation forced a brutal reassessment of motive. The secret had not been preserved solely out of fear of the past, but out of dependence on it. What began generations earlier as a desperate compromise had evolved into an unspoken economic model. Human lives were not sacrificed for belief alone, but to protect access, control, and continuity. The sisters' role, as witnesses confined to the margins, now made a grim kind of sense. They were living deterrents and living records, positioned where extraction and secrecy intersected. Their presence allowed the town to pretend the boundary was cultural rather than commercial, fate rather than choice. When confronted with this evidence, town leaders no longer spoke in moral terms. They spoke of jobs, of families fed, of winters survived. The language of necessity replaced the language of denial. Survival, they argued, had always demanded sacrifice. The mountain gave, but it also took, and the town had simply learned how to manage that exchange. This turning point stripped away any remaining ambiguity. The secret was not an accident of history or a relic of superstition. It was an ongoing transaction, one that tied prosperity to silence and made the cost of truth unbearable. The sisters, the missing, the erased, were not anomalies but expenses, absorbed into the balance sheet of a town that had chosen endurance over innocence and built its future on what it refused to acknowledge. The 10th turning point arrived as the full weight of the town's choices came into focus, forcing the community to confront the moral cost of survival. Once the cellar had been revealed, the symbols interpreted, the old cases resurfaced, and the economic dependency uncovered, it became impossible to maintain the illusion that the mountain's secrets were benign or merely historical. What had once seemed like isolated tragedies, the sisters' absence, the erased children, the whispered rituals, was revealed to be part of a deliberately maintained system, one that intertwined fear, duty, and profit across generations. As investigators traced connections between families, businesses, and land holdings, it became clear that nearly every household had played a role, whether through active participation, tacit consent, or willful ignorance. The silence that had been enforced so carefully was not a product of one individual's power but of collective complicity. People who had once justified inaction as prudence or respect for tradition now faced the unbearable recognition that they had tolerated harm in order to preserve comfort and security. The mountain, long viewed as a natural barrier and spiritual entity, was revealed as a repository of the town's moral compromises. The discovery of additional journals, correspondence, and ledger books made the consequences of this complicity undeniable. Records documented the sisters' forced observation, detailed instances of threats disguised as guidance, and noted which families had enforced boundaries and which had benefited economically from maintaining secrecy. The evidence showed that the town had not merely survived, it had thrived at the cost of human lives and human dignity, carefully balancing profit and coercion as if ethical considerations were secondary ledger entries. As the story gained attention, divisions appeared within the community. Some clung to rationalizations, insisting the secrecy was necessary to avoid external interference or economic collapse. Others were haunted by conscience, realizing that generations of obedience had perpetuated harm, and that the mountain's resources, once thought to justify silence, were secured through exploitation, not necessity. The truth left no room for partial acknowledgement. Every act of preservation, every silent complicity, became part of the tally. Ultimately, the turning point forced the town to confront a question that could not be evaded: had survival justified the sacrifices demanded by secrecy, or had the community simply surrendered morality to maintain comfort? The hidden cellar, the missing records, the carved symbols, and the vanished lives were no longer abstractions, they were proof of choices made consciously, repeated across decades. The mountain had been a silent witness, but the town itself had been the active participant, enforcing a system that allowed darkness to persist beneath a veneer of normalcy, and ensuring that the cost of revelation was measured in lives, not words.